Sir, Ramakrishnan sir, shall we start, sir? Ramakrishnan sir?
Yeah, we can start, sir.
Yes, madam. Preeti madam.
Has he logged in? Yeah, she is there.
Preeti madam. Preeti madam. Preeti madam. Post பண்ணிட்டீங்களா? Preeti madam. ஆமா பிரீத்தி எம் தான்.
Preeti Srinivas, அது வேற யாரையோ பண்ணிருக்காங்க.
பிரீத்தி எம் தான்.
Sir, madam, Preeti madam also joined, I think. Preeti Srinivas, madam.
பிரீத்தி எம். நீங்க எல்லாத்தையும் போஸ்ட் பண்ணி வச்சிருக்கீங்க.
Preeti madam.
Sir, I'm here, sir. உங்க screen sharing attempt பண்ணுங்க.
Not audible, madam. Okay.
Sir?
Don't shake your hand.
Any problem, ma'am?
ஒரு பிரீத்தியோட இதை எடுத்துடணும்.
Fine, sir. Can you see the screen, sir?
Yeah, definitely, ma'am. It's visible.
Okay, sir. And I'll attempt one more. So I want to also share one video.
Yes, madam.
Sir, எப்படி போறது இந்த இதுக்கு?
Sharing, madam. Videoவா?
இன்டர்நெட்ல ஒரு வீடியோ இருக்கு.
அப்போ நீங்க வந்து you have to go for the entire screen முதல்ல. Share entire screen, then
share entire screen. Share computer sound போட்டேன்.
Computer sound from the more option.
Opening screen for video.
Are you going to do one thing, madam?
அந்த லிங்க் உங்களுக்கு அனுப்பிச்சிருக்கேன்ல சார், அது நீங்க ப்ளே பண்ணிடலாம் பின்ன.
ஓகே மேடம்.
அனுப்பிச்சிருக்கேன்ல சார் உங்களுக்கு?
இல்ல நீங்க only PPT தான் அனுப்பி இருக்கீங்க மேடம். வீடியோ
இல்ல லிங்க்கும் அனுப்பிச்சிருக்கேன்.
சரிங்களா
சார்?
அது நீங்க in between செஷன்ல கூட நீங்க வந்து உங்க இந்த PPT க்ளோஸ் இது பண்ணிட்டு மினிமைஸ் பண்ணிட்டு அப்படியே பண்ணிக்கலாம் மேடம்.
So now I'll see, let me see whether it is coming,
okay.
sir.
So otherwise now also you open the video, madam, then minimize it. Yeah, it's coming, madam.
An ignorant
video
savage.
Yeah, yes, madam. Sound also coming.
I guess
sound
it must be so.
Yes, madam. You now pause the video and minimize it.
Minimize, sir?
Yeah. You go to the first half videos, pause it and minimize, madam. Yes.
Okay.
Now it will be in the open app, one of the open app like your PPT. So you share screen, and share screen, then you select this video, it will come. If you are doing the PPT first, select PPT, and you are doing PPT. In between, if you want to go to video, stop share, then again share, then you select video. After showing the video, again stop share, come to the PPT again. That you can do, madam.
Videos in the last, sir.
Yeah, then no problem. Okay.
So.
Perfect. Madam, as usual now, sir, formality, madam, the welcome and introducing the speaker, everything will be there, madam. Then you
okay,
can...
okay, sir. We can start, sir.
Yes, madam. So now, it's the fourth day of the webinar series. I hand over the platform to Dr. Ramakrishnan sir, HOD and convener of the webinar series. Please, Ramakrishnan sir, take over, sir.
Good evening, everyone. Today is the penultimate day of our webinar series. And I feel greatly honored to welcome, first of all, as usual, Dr. Rahim, who has been a driving force behind this entire webinar series. Then I would like to welcome our resource person today, Dr. Maria Preeti Srinivasan, a well-known scholar in the field of indigenous studies. I hope that you are, the audience would be here for your treat today. Now I would like to welcome all my staff members, and I would also like to invite all the participants who have been showing a lot of patience today, especially due to some hiccup in the entire process. But nevertheless, they have been encouraging us by sending excellent messages, praising the nature of the seminar, the timing, as well as they also suggest future titles which could be utilized for our next webinar series. I thank all of them. Now I would like to invite Professor V.R. Prasanna Kumar, Department of English, for introducing the speaker officially. Thank you.
Yes. Good evening, sir. Am I audible to you, sir?
Yeah, audible, sir.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thanks a lot, sir. Preeti, madam, good evening.
Good evening, sir. Yes. Nice to see you.
Yes, thank you, madam. Thanks a lot. Indeed, it is my privilege to have this opportunity of introducing the speaker of the day, Dr. Maria Preeti Srinivasan. Dr. Maria Preeti Srinivasan, Associate Professor of English, the head of the Department of English, Queen Mary's College, Chennai, is a renowned scholar and a great academician. She is also a very skillful and a dedicated teacher. She did her doctoral research on the life writings of Australian Aboriginal, Indian Dalit and Adivasi women with a focus on their empowerment. This doctoral research secured the Endeavour Award in the year 2006, sponsored by the Department of Education, Science and Training, Government of Australia. She received this award from the Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. John Howard, on his visit to India in the same year. Under the aegis of this award, she was a visiting scholar at the School of English Media Performance Studies, UNSW, Sydney, till the year 2007. And also, she received Australia-India Council Fellowship Award in the year 2008. She has traveled abroad several times. Academically, she has traveled Australia. She has traveled in Australia and in European countries. She has so many publications in well-reputed journals. Besides all these things, she is a very skillful and dedicated creative writer. She has published so many books. She has published an anthology of poems, a collection of essays also. In short, I would like to say, in addition to her domestic achievements and performance, in addition to her domestic achievements and popularity, her international honor and recognition is sufficiently large to place her well securely in the forefront of the great scholars of our times. Hence, we have such a wonderful and dynamic person for our today's talk. I welcome you, ma'am, to deliver your talk on theory and the indigenous worldview. Now, I hand over this platform to Dr. Maria Preeti, ma'am. Thank you. Thanks you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Prasanna Kumar.
Thank you, madam. Thanks a lot.
I would like to place on record also my gratitude to
and also I would like to thank our head. I'm very extremely sorry. I would like to thank our head, Dr. Ramakrishnan sir, for having given me this opportunity. Thank you. Thanks a lot, ma'am.
I'm also grateful for this opportunity to be a part of the Presidency Department of English family and to take part in your lecture series. I'm grateful to the principal for giving me this opportunity, to Dr. Ramakrishnan for recommending me for this, for being a speaker on this occasion. My heartfelt thanks to Dr. Rahim for his involvement in this lecture series, and I'm very grateful to him for the sessions that we had before this to make us comfortable with this new way of communicating. So and I also say a big warm hello to all my friends in the Department of English, Presidency College, and students, faculty, friends from other colleges. Very pleased to be with you this evening. So without further ado, let me go to my presentation. The title of this presentation, Theory and the Indigenous Worldview, might invoke associations of eco-criticism, ecology, relation to the landscape, connectedness to the landscape. But I would like to clear the air of any such misconceptions. It is not entirely about being connected to the land, though it's part of that. There are so many ramifications with regard to the indigenous worldview. As we all know, indigenous societies have been subjected to dispossession. The land has been raped, the people have been colonized, and given that history, it is appreciable that they have been able to survive and preserve their culture, preserve their stories, preserve their history. And this is something that we need to engage with, to interrogate, while also taking cognizance of the process of colonization. When we can think of how the lives and experiences of indigenous people have contributed to literary theory, it goes through a gamut of phases, even from the idea of nation, to one's relationship to nature, from nation to nature, you can say. Here before you, you have a map of Aboriginal Australia. So you might have conceived a different sort of map of Australia with the 8 territories. That is the political map of Australia. This is equally political because it shows the nations within the nation. The concept of nation itself has undergone a great transformation with post-colonial studies, with people of different ethnic backgrounds and ethnicities being seen as nations. And in the context of multiculturalism and migration, they are seen as transnationals. So dispossessed people do consider themselves through their, keeping with their ethnic identity. So when you look at this map, what can we learn of Aboriginal Australia? One of the things that is there in these communities is that colonization, was such a rude shock to them, because the idea of transgressing into another person's territory is absolutely alien. So if you look at these different nations marked on this map, if people have to move from from their marked territory, from their region, to another region, they have to seek permission. So for example, even today, if you're giving us a talk, a lecture in Sydney, you might be speaking in Parramatta, and traditionally Parramatta, even the modern Parramatta, traditionally belongs to a certain tribe. So when you stand on that ground and speak, your first utterance, your very first utterance should be, I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Eora tribe, whichever tribe lived there centuries ago, or whichever tribe traditionally owned the place. So now this is also what they call protocols. So this is one of the many protocols, and this holds a very important lesson for us in modern day, where we recognize people's territories, we denounce incursion into another territory, but it is happening in the world, and it's sad that it's happening. So here, when we talk about the indigenous worldview, we have to take cognizance of colonization and how indigenous people navigated that, how they, on one side, their land was appropriated, and they had loss of language, there was dispossession, but they also appropriated the colonizers' language. So as far as now, how does the history of indigenous people or indigenous historiography contribute to theory? Indigenous people, one of the survival strategies, or one of the things that helped them to survive, was transnational connections, right? So if you look at the civil rights movement in Australia, it was influenced very much by the civil rights movement in America, and the idea of Black power, and calling themselves the Black people of Australia. And they modeled a lot of their strategies on Black power in America. Transnational feminism, there's a book called Scattered Hegemonies, Transnational Feminism by Karen Kaplan and Inderpal Garewal. It is a very interesting book. Now, transnational feminism does not elide regional differences, it does not elide location, but on the other hand, it recognizes that there is difference in that way, there is difference, but it creates a world space, a space, almost you may say it's like a Venn diagram, where you have points of intersection and points of difference, where there are some places that there is in which there is overlapping. So Karen Kaplan and Inderpal Garewal, they have formulated this notion of transnational feminism just for the practice of alternative feminism, for the sharing of knowledge across communities that are not white, okay, so the feminism by white women is generally referred to as global feminism. There is a politics of location involved in this transnational feminism, but this is not to merge differences, but rather to acknowledge the spatial, temporal, geographical, historical differences, to celebrate differences, and to look for points of intersection and forge alliances. That's the main objective of transnational approaches. So you can see that so much of empowerment was there in the civil rights movements in Australia, only because they looked at what was happening in America as a precedent from which they could draw strategies, draw knowledge, draw information, and work their own strategies. So I would like to divide my lecture into three sections. One is story and theory, the other about woman, native and other, and the third is about the land, how the land itself is a text. This concept that story is theory comes from the writings of Lee Maracle, First Nations Canadian woman, leader of in the Red Power movement of the 60s, and a prolific writer and academician. So she says she has written an article, and which later became a book, called Oratory Coming to Theory. So how does she say story and theory? You know, what is her argument to say that story is theory? It's very simple. So she says that, you know, in times past, when their grandmothers and people in the communities told stories, stories were not just to put a child to bed, but or to entertain, but stories had deep values and it was connected to the laws, or kinship laws, cultural laws, and stories had a great import in that sense. So trying to relate it to our modern world, she says that stories are integral part of indigenous cultures. So relating it to our modern world, she says, in a textbook, in a science textbook, you might have an example of metamorphosis, for example, or any process, any procedure. So an example of metamorphosis, you might give the example of the tadpole to the frog, or the caterpillar to the butterfly. So an example, you teach through an example. And in the example, in the story that is told, for the sake of a theory, to illustrate something, there is plot, there's a climax, there's a conclusion. Similarly, in a mathematical problem, when you have a mathematical problem can also be seen as a story. In the place of numbers, right? You have human character. So let's take a mathematical problem, simple arithmetic that we teach children. We say that so many mangoes were bought and so many mangoes were consumed, and we ask the child how many mangoes are left. And the whole idea is to arrive at a principle of subtraction. But to this principle of subtraction is arrived at through a story. So stories and mathematical problems have the same components, right? In the place of numbers, you have human character in a story. That's the only difference. And in resolving a mathematical problem, there is a plot line, right? There are steps in a mathematical problem. What do we do next? Step 1, step 2, step 3. So this is how you solve a mathematical problem. And the tension in a math problem is one number versus another, whether they are added, subtracted, and then the tension is resolved into some sort of conclusion from the two numbers representing the original tension. This analogy between the working out of a mathematical problem and the construction of a narrative expounds this very challenging notion that there is story in theory. The story, as we know, is, as we can, we don't need a theory from an indigenous scholar to tell us that. It's something that might strike us, that story is very integral to education, to value systems, to building up communities, to culture. And what do we, and how do we, and what about cultural transmission? What do we transmit in culture? We transmit values, we transmit values with regard to relationships, the place of the elderly in the community, the place of children in the community, how we need to relate to of the flora and fauna around us. All these are values. At this time, I'm reminded of a story from the Stradbroke Dreamtime, which is by Udguru Nonakal, or her name was, that was her traditional name, also known as Cat Walker. So Stradbroke is an island, and there, this family, Udguru's family, these are all autobiographical stories. The children are playing, and one day they kill the kookaburra, and they take a slingshot and kill the kookaburra, and just for fun. When the father comes to know of it, he tells the children that they will not have their supper that day because they killed the bird which laughs. So in their traditional knowledge, they would never kill a kookaburra. They might kill a kangaroo, they might kill an emu for food, but never a kookaburra. So this is a kind of value that is handed down through the oral tradition and through practices. So Lee Maracle, this Native American writer, she says that when she wrote her book, I Am Woman, she intended to write theory. She was actually telling a lot of stories, but her intention and her objective was to come up with theory, especially theory to reinforce the indigenous perspective of life vis-a-vis the capitalist Western orientation. So here we have Larissa Behrendt. She's a lawyer and in the University of Technology, Sydney, and she's the author of a novel called Home. So she says that law is a language, right? And whatever rhetoric one uses in a court of law, one can convince very effectively through stories. And in indigenous communities, stories were passed on from generation to generation, were perpetuated only with the objective of transmitting values, right? Whereas these stories very often are marketed, like even in India, you have the Jataka tales, and they're all marketed as children's stories, the Panchatantra, but they are stories that transmit cultural values. So there is a kind of comparative study that I'd like to do between the writings of Lee Maracle and Jackie Huggins. So Jackie, you have two texts here that you can see, Auntie Rita and Sister Girl. Auntie Rita is the life story of Jackie's mother, right? And Sister Girl is again a book like Lee Maracle's I Am Woman, full of anecdotes. It is historiography, but she theorizes all along. She theorizes, and she claims that that is her text on her definitive text on on what it means to be an Aboriginal woman. So in these parallel readings that I'm making, I'd just like to go over a few intersections, few connections that reinforce their perspective on the indigenous woman definitely in the non-indigenous world, and how indigenous women hold their place and yet transact with the other, right? So there is a we and a they, the we being the indigenous community and they being the other, white people. So in both women, you see, have moved from writing life story to writing theory. Lee Maracle's autobiography was titled Bobby Lee, Indian Rebel, and her book of theory which is again a book of stories from the community, which you could read like a memoir, is a whole lot of theorizing. And in this book, she says that it is a well-researched book. This I Am Woman is a well-researched book. She did study, she did work in the library, did a lot of reading on capitalism, on colonialism, and then made a spiritual journey to draw on the strengths of her cultural values. And in this process, she realized that she had assimilated, she was made to assimilate, isn't it? And that her life had been orchestrated by the power structure. She saw herself as someone who was absolutely twisted in. It took me 25 years to unravel the twisted me, she says. I began to put my need to write stories ahead of the political words. I became a woman through my words. And both, so you see, both Jackie and Lee have made this transition from writing the autobiography to writing a text, which is again quite like an autobiography, but which they very firmly and characteristically declare that it is a book of theory and not story. Another point of intersection that we see, or something that is parallel in both books, is the mother-daughter relationships. Jackie's book about her mother is titled Auntie Rita. So having traveled in Australia and traveled among Aboriginal communities, we find that auntie, very much like it's in India, it's not necessarily something that is a biological relationship. Any senior person in the community is respectfully addressed as auntie. They don't call them on their first name basis as it would be in the Western world. So that is why she decided to call her mother's book Auntie Rita, because it just showed her mother's place in the community. Lee Maracle and Jackie Huggins speak about the place of grandmothers in the community. And the respect that is accorded to elderly women in the community. They also focus on the mentoring role played by older women towards younger women. And in, Jackie's book is titled Sister Girl. So another word for sister in Aboriginal parlance is Tiddas. So this word Tidda, hello Tidda, how are you Tidda? That's the way their conversation goes very often. So Tiddas indicates that, the sisterhood between them. Jackie reflects a lot on the conversations she's had with her mother, and she, labels that as the mothering tongue and the daughtering tongue. So the mothering tongue is instructive, is concerned about the daughter, is whereas the daughtering tongue could be rebellious because of the generation gap. But then there is wisdom in the mothering tongue. So she says, and the mothering tongue is, and considering the fact that Auntie Rita was taken away from the traditional lands and put in a settlement and went through this trauma of being decolonized, being taken away from her kith and kin and community and the land to which she belonged. So the mothering tongue is one which speaks from hundreds of years of segregation and near annihilation. It speaks of hardships, the failed relationships and the friendships, as much as it speaks of the isolation, racism, and paternalism. So in an Aboriginal community, an older woman is either referred to as auntie or nan. Nan would be the grandmother. Jackie Huggins theorizes on this, saying that, you know, someone in her mother's position wouldn't even be thinking that she's speaking theoretically. But nevertheless, when she speaks, it is political. It is political because the personal is political. And in this sharing that takes place between mother and daughter, there is a reclaiming and rewriting of history. So considering the fact that a woman of an older generation is not able to write her story, her daughter writes the story for her, there itself we see that her voice is, it could be muffled, or you could also take it as a case of ventriloquism, one speaking for the other. And that is why Jackie in her text had two kinds of fonts. So she recorded her mother's story in one font and her part of her comments or her response in italics. So that way both voices were heard, and she tried to get out of that cul-de-sac, as it were, of speaking for her mother, which would defeat the purpose of writing the book itself. So she brought her mother's voice had to be heard. Speaking of the role of mothers and grandmothers, Lee Maracle has written this: I know nothing of great mysteries, no less of creation. I do know that the farther backward in time that I travel, the more grandmothers, and the farther forward, the more grandchildren. I am obligated to both. Lee Maracle's response to Christianity is one of anger, which sees the Christian intervention in Aboriginal societies through the missions as working in tandem with the colonial agenda. Whereas, Rita Huggins also was put on a mission, stayed on a mission, but the resentment is not that strong. So she puts it across humorously, saying, you can take the black fellow out of the mission, but you cannot take the mission out of the black fellow. So the Christian values and Christian outlook is embraced by many Aboriginal people in Australia. However, they are able to transact and make the transition between Aboriginal spirituality and Christianity, which is very interesting. They practice both forms of spirituality, and this brings us to, seeing the difference between religion and spirituality. Religion is institutionalized, whereas spirituality is sans boundaries, borders. It's more about cultivating the intuitive self. So Rita is appreciative of how Aboriginal people are able to practice both. And for example, in a funeral in an Aboriginal community, the coffin is smoked. There's a smoking ceremony. They burn the eucalyptus leaves, and very much like the fakir, who comes to the puts the what is that, sambrani that they put, something like that. They smoke the eucalyptus leaves, and then the mourners also pass through the smoke. There's another person who is a classic example of connecting traditional and Christian spirituality. That's Margaret Tucker, and she's an Aboriginal woman. She was influenced by the moral rearmament movement, and in connection with that, she traveled to America, and the meeting was on an island. And tradition has it that the chief, the Native American chief, many years ago prophesied that people of many nations would come to that island and speak about peace. So like this, they're able to connect with spirituality irrespective of where it comes from. Another thing that they reinforce in their theoretical writings is difference, articulating difference from the women's movement. As I said, they draw on transnational sharing, but steer clear of alliances, forging alliances with Western women, or to allow that kind of representation of Aboriginal women by non-Aboriginal women. Another thing that I'd like to point out is that these women, Lee Maracle, Trin Minha, Jackie Huggins, Eileen Morton Robinson, they are university educated women. So you can see this book, Eileen Morton Robinson's Talking Up to the White Woman. And also the other one, Whitening Race. So this is about, both books are about whiteness studies. Interestingly, blackness has been interrogated, blackness has been celebrated, but writers like Jackie Huggins, Trin Minha, Eileen Morton Robinson feel that the liberation could come through interrogating whiteness, because whiteness, white male is the norm. So if that is the norm, and if that is interrogated, that is analyzed, that is investigated, then they are able to work out their liberation based on that. If you look at the chapters in this book, Talking Up to the White Woman, it is about representation, self-representation through life writings, and then about white woman in feminist theory, representations of the white woman in feminist theory, about representations of indigenous women in Australian feminism, and about TIDAS, that is about sisterhood, and about self-representation, and also talking up to the white woman. Now, what does this talking up to the white woman actually speak of? Because it's all about the politics of representation. See, there was an anthropologist named Diane Bell who wrote about Aboriginal women, and writers like Jackie Huggins, though that was historical, that Jackie Huggins wrote an essay taking on the claims of Diane Bell to speak for Aboriginal women. So this is what they mean by talking up to the white woman. And as I had told you earlier, that they have drawn a lot on transnational sharing. So Jackie Huggins, on one of her visits to America, she attended a lecture by Bell Hooks, and then she was surprised that one day Australian Broadcasting Corporation invited her to interview Bell Hooks on Australian TV. So because she had become a well-known writer by then, and in this book, Sister Girl, this interview with Bell Hooks is there, and they discuss the idea of representation. representation, slavery, women in domestic service, how Aboriginal women work for white women, how African American women have worked for white women, and the intervention of anthropologists in the community, how Aboriginal women and African American women do not feel comfortable in conferences organized by white women. Trin Minha is again an academic, and you might have seen an essay by her in the Post-Colonial Studies Reader. She's written a book, Woman, Native, Other. And here, though they are looking at alternatives to Western feminism, they do engage with some of the liberatory aspects of Western feminism, but only questioning all the while that the idea of white male being the norm. And another thing that they foreground is silences, the silences of women of color. And why do women of color have to write? Women of color have to write because they have been written about. Okay? Anthropologists have written about them, theoreticians have written about them, feminists have written about them, and they are in a way weary of this representation by others. So the act of, she says, Trin Minha says, the act of writing is to dispossess myself. Writing has to be done because a colored woman of color has to dispossess herself. And she says that, and this is something, of course, that's common knowledge, anthropology is a Western science, but anthropology has done the most disservice to indigenous communities, both in America and in Australia, because in the 1930s, especially in America, this ethnography was at its peak. There was a famous ethnographer named Franz Boas, and they had this practice of going into the indigenous communities, finding an informant and collecting life narratives along certain parameters. Those parameters would be all the rites of passage that would be covered, birth, puberty, death, then also other cultural practices, the place of the woman in the family, in the community. Also, they would look at spiritual practices, and all these things would be documented through an interpreter, through some contact in the community. So the question of authorship was also very unethical in that sense. Now in retrospect seems unethical. And the idea of going into a community and taking their traditional knowledge, documenting it. And as we know, the whole colonial process, a great deal of the success of the colonial enterprise was because of research, because communities and people were researched so well. Even in our country, if you look at William Logan's Malabar Manual, you'll find it in the Connemara Library in the rare books section. He has literally documented every blade of grass in the Malabar. He has, documented the food habits of communities, the religious practices of different castes, and all their rites. And all this served as enough material to dispossess the native inhabitants. So when it comes to Aboriginal writing, indigenous writing, subjectivity is very, very important. That is why life writings play a very important part in indigenous theory, because these through anthropology, these anthropologists and ethnographers, objectified these people by writing about them. So having been written about, the most subversive thing that they can do is to write about themselves. All right. And being written about was instrumental in their dispossession, and they writing their own life stories in that sense would be liberating and would help them to reclaim their place in history. Another problem that indigenous people encounter is the question of authenticity. So we know that with the incursions into these communities, many the pure blood people were few, and the misogynated products of misogynation were many. So half bloods, octoroons, quatroons, people with 1/4 blood, native blood. And however, these octoroons, quatroons, half castes grew up in the community. So they probably had light skin and blue eyes, but since they grew up in the community, they were more Aboriginal. But when they told their stories, they were charged with not being authentic Aboriginal. So they also, in their theoretical writings, address this question of authenticity. So the demand, who places this demand for authenticity? It is the other, it is the colonizer who places this demand for authenticity. Yeah. So now they also, the indigenous worldview is also very significant with regard to the land. This Catherine Berndt and Ronald Berndt, they wrote a book called The Speaking Land. This is the book, yeah, The Speaking Land. And this is a collection of myths from different regions, all the regions across Australia. And in this book, they state that, the land is, they call it the speaking land because everything is so symbolic. And if you have read Aboriginal mythology or know about Aboriginal mythology, you know that the land came into being, and the landforms came into being when mythical beings, spiritual beings walked across the land. So sometimes when they walked across, rivers were made. Sometimes people were turned into stone. Sometimes a tree became a river. Sometimes then the story of the seven sisters, these birds which went into the sky as the seven sisters. So like this, there are so many stories which are related to the creation of the world. The world was created through these, in the dream time, through these creative beings and spirits. So these mythical beings made themselves or turned themselves into some aspect of the physical environment. And these stories also have a moral aspect to them. I'll tell you a story here. See, for instance, in this slide, you see the three sisters. It's a rock formation in the Blue Mountains in Australia. And the story behind it is that there were three sisters who were being pursued by a man who was not eligible to marry them, right? Because according to the cultural laws, he should not marry them. It was wrong for him to marry them. And so to protect these young women from transgressing the law, a witch doctor turned them into stone. So this story bears has a moral that these women did not succumb to being pursued by this man who was not of their skin type and who was not allowed to marry them. So like this, the land is full of signposts. So this is what I want to emphasize. Ronald Berndt and Catherine Berndt say that it appears as if the land is bristling with notice boards. So every object on the landscape, rock, hill, tree, river, sky, everything around is full of signs, and these signs can be read. It's like driving on the road and you see signs which tell you whether you have, which tell you whether you can turn right or left or go straight. It's as clear as that, these signs on the landscape. Now, in terms of, now this is the, the land speaks, but today, does the land speak? With the land being exploited for capitalistic gain, with bauxite mining taking place, with trees being felled, with mining, all kinds of mining being done in, Australia is rich in uranium. So then also coal mining, all kinds of mining being done. There is this, and when these mining projects are there, these communities which live on that land have to be given compensation. So there is a totally new dynamics in place in relation to land now. So the landforms at one point of time they were fraught with this spiritual significance, but here in the neo-colonial dispensation, there is also this very capitalistic commercial response to land. So the neo-Aboriginal view of the land is subjugated to socio-economic and political ends. I was mentioning subjectivity in relation to the indigenous worldview. So it's a cliche, isn't it, that history is written by the conqueror. So you have these, have revisionist historiography by one famous revisionist historiographer is Henry Reynolds. And you can see this title, Why Weren't We Told? So he grew up not knowing, he has Aboriginal heritage, but he grew up not knowing much about his identity. So his own personal search for his identity unraveled a lot about indigenous history. So you see the other book also, The Other Side of the Frontier, is about Aboriginal narratives of conquest. So the colonizers' narratives of conquest will definitely be anathema to the Aboriginal narrative of conquest. So from the colonizer's perspective, the Aboriginal man is seen as dark, evil, ferocious, and not to be trusted, someone who's dangerous. And here you have, because of modernity, empowerment, Aboriginal people knowing English, being able to tell their stories that were told to them by their forefathers of the conquest. Such stories have been recorded, and you have these documents of revisionist history. So how important subjectivity is in tilting the scales back and for the truth to be told. One important story in this connection of revisionist history is the story of Mabo. Now, what Mabo has made a significant contribution to Aboriginal history because he was a friend of Henry Reynolds, and this was at the James Cook University. So he was just a gardener there. Mabo was just a gardener in James Cook University, but he was a knowledge seeker, and he kept company with Henry Reynolds. And one day, over a cup of coffee or something like that, Mabo mentioned that he had lands. He had lands in his native place, in the Murray region, and Reynolds said that he couldn't own land because all that land was crown land. So the idea of his traditional land being crown land was totally unacceptable to Mabo, and he filed a case, the famous Mabo versus Queensland case. So in this Mabo versus Queensland case, the victory that Mabo was able to get was through the case being fought on the grounds that Australia was not terra nullius. That means when Captain Cook arrived, he declared that the land was terra nullius. There was no inhabitant, and therefore that land could be taken by the British. And he planted the British flag when he landed at Botany Bay. So overturning the doctrine of terra nullius was what helped Mabo win the case, and that was this Mabo versus Queensland was historic because it totally changed the perception of ownership of land, that the land was colonized, the acknowledgement of Australia being a colonized country and the land belonging to the original inhabitants, and they had land rights and they had native title claims, and if that land had to be used by the government or taken by the government for some purpose, they had to negotiate with the native communities for that. So, this is the difference between land rights and native title. Land rights is a land, it's a grant, it's given. A request is made by the community and it is given, but not so in native title. Native title, they prove that they have a traditional connection to the land. It's not just a land right would be a request for land to be used. Native title is establishing their traditional connection to the land. So Ronald and Catherine Berndt have used the term the speaking land, and we said that the land speaks. It's because it's as if there are notice boards all over the place, and land forms. Maybe a rock which has a certain formation has a story to tell. There's a certain rock which looks like it has a long tongue, and people say that there was a man who was very thirsty and he went around asking for water and nobody heard him, and he became his voice became hoarse and his tongue elongated, became so long, and that is the background to that rock having that shape. So we can read landscape as text. The idea of landscape as text is not new. It is there. A lot of people in eco-criticism and ecology look at the land as text. Interestingly, even in the world of human geography, they look at the landscape as text, because it has symbolic meaning. Okay, landscape is a cultural construction, a particular way of structuring and representing the world. So it is landscape is not merely a physical landscape, but also a way of seeing. So instead of seeing the landscape as an external physical object, it is seen as a system to produce and transmit meanings through representations. And one of the things that is important in relation to a text is the text is a metaphor, isn't it? So its texts use metaphors. So similarly, in the landscape also speaks through signs, signification, through metaphors. The land has text-like qualities. So contemporary semiotic research has progressively shifted to the meaning of textuality to reconceptualize the traditional notion of text as a closed product with fixed borders and defined by internal coherence. So earlier, if we look at the earlier notions of text, it was like a set of constellations, fixed. But with post-structuralism, with cultural studies, the idea of text has expanded, and the world is a text, landscape is a text. We can read signboards, we read advertisements, both in the print media and in the electronic media. So the traditional notion of text has undergone a change. And there could be multiple interpretations of a text. Before that, I want to draw your attention to the work of David Tacey. And this is a lovely book called The Edge of the Sacred. David Tacey is a white Australian, but his family moved to Alice Springs because his sister was asthmatic, and she would probably have died of that kind of struggle that she had. And so the family was advised to move to a very dry place. So they went to Central Australia. And there in Central Australia, you had a lot of Aboriginal people living in this desert area, and they were able to, he had a lot of interactions with the Aboriginal people. And he started looking at their worldview, at their spirituality, and was able to connect with them. So he says that connectedness to the earth is not because there is soul in earth, but because there is earth in us. Well, David Tacey's Edge of the Sacred, David Tacey is based on a lot of Jungian ideas. Jung didn't visit Australia, but Jung worked a lot among American Indian tribes. And the idea of the collective unconscious, and then the mythopoetic view of the land. This is what David Tacey learned through his engagement with Jungian philosophy and his real life experiences in Central Australia. So the thing that we learn through our engagement with the indigenous worldview is that though colonization has taken place, though Australia may be said in terms of Western records to be 200 years old, 220 years old, it is much older than that. The nation is new, but the land is ancient. David Tacey's Edge of the Sacred is a book I'd highly recommend, because he talks a lot about Aboriginal spirituality and how he was able to transcend all his prejudices about Aboriginal views, about Aboriginal spirituality, and he was actually empowered by his association with Aboriginal people in Alice Springs and educated through his connection with them about how to connect with the land. So as I said earlier at the outset, theory in relation to the indigenous worldview is about land, is about respect for the land. It is also about celebrating difference, right? Because they celebrate their difference from white people. And it is also about foregrounding subjectivity and reclaiming their history. And they are able to navigate the space between the other and themselves, appropriating where they have to appropriate and relinquishing or severing where they would like to sever, reviving their culture. And when you look at someone like David Tacey and his engagement with Aboriginality, you find that there is a shared history. So there have been many white intellectuals, white researchers who have been accepted in Aboriginal communities. They have been initiated also. You know, they have gone through the initiation rites, and only if they go through those initiation rites, you know, traditional knowledge is shared with them. So Lynette Russell says that definitely this give and take is there. You know, if you've seen that novel by The Secret River, in the novel Secret River, that phrase, give a little, take a little, is reiterated. So giving and taking and forging a shared history is the ideal to which they are working. So even concluding once again with the idea of land and the response to land as a text, seeing it as a metaphor, seeing the world as metaphor, seeing the signs and signification in the land, looking at metaphorical meanings in the land, we find that you know, Northrop Frye has also been influenced by Jung, and well, he locates his thinking within structuralism. When he was also, you know, very fond of Blake's poems, and when he all the myth and interpretation of myths in that, but his approach was formalist. When you look at the land as text, right? Is it a text that has already been written by someone like a god figure? I was talking about the dream time and about mythical beings moving across the landscape. So was the land already written? Is the land being written? If you look at it from a post-structuralist angle, the writing is going on, isn't it? The writing takes place. So Trinh Minha says, the story never stops, beginning or ending, it is built on difference. So Roland Barthes says, no, that the text is traversal, all right? That the work is on the shelf, but the text is there in the world, the text is intertextual. So this kind of intertextuality and interpretation of the land is dynamic. It is not static. It is not just based on the stories that have been handed down to them. So let me give you an example in concluding. You know, in Auntie Rita, there's this incident where Auntie Rita is standing at her kitchen window and looking out, and suddenly she sees a crow, a black crow, and that black crow stretches out its arms, its wings, stretches out its wings in the shape, and it looks like a black cross to her. At that moment, she feels this is ominous, this is a bad sign, and she could receive bad news. So then the telephone rings, and then it is bad news for her, news conveying that someone dear has passed away. So you see her Aboriginal mindset, her way of thinking, her way of interpreting just that sight of the bird outside her window, interpreting a sign, okay, where in this interpretation she brings both her Christian affinities as well as her traditional way of looking at a sign. So that is why we say that this kind of different ways of seeing the land is taking place, and the land is not necessarily been, written into place by a creator or a creative being, but definitely in their reading of the land and even in their writing of the land, that kind of dynamism, that kind of evolution is taking place. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for that wonderful talk. With your permission, I invite questions from the participants. There is a question. Land in indigenous context is a blessing or a curse for the Aboriginal?
Could you repeat, madam?
Land in indigenous context is a blessing or curse for the Aboriginal?
Depends, madam, because, if you look at colonization, the sites of the rape of the land may be few, but there are vast stretches of land that have that still remain pristine and untouched by human hand, and people do live in these very remote places, especially Central Australia, desert places. There are communities that do not come in contact with white Australia. So they are leading their traditional lives. They have their traditional languages, and they are preserved from that kind of colonial influence. So land is a blessing. I would say land is a blessing because they feel connected to the land. It gives them a spiritual strength. It gives them spiritual strength. For example, I traveled to Weipa, which is near the Gulf of Carpentaria, and over there, there is a time in the, when they expect a storm. So all the old women in the community, they get into a van and they travel to the coastline, and they all hold hands together and they yell out to the sea. They talk to the sea and tell them, don't invade the land, right? And community life is something that has been revived, especially all the places which were once reserves, reserves where they had a white superintendent controlling them. Those places have been given to the Aboriginal Land Council, and definitely there is self-determination. So the land is used by them in the way they want to use it. As I told you about the Mabo case, with land rights and native title, with their achievement of land rights and native title, through years of struggle for representation, they have now achieved their status as the rightful owners of the land.
Thank you, ma'am. Another question. Is transnational feminism and womanism same? If no, how do they differ?
Is transnational feminism and
womanism same?
Womanism.
Yeah.
Okay. Womanism is specific to African American. This what's her name? Alice Walker has written about it. Womanism and transnational feminism are not synonymous because it is a cross-cultural engagement. It's a cross-cultural engagement where they find similarities and they work on and they celebrate difference. Celebrating, see, Lee Maracle, she says that she's a Native American woman, but in her quest, she is looking at other women who are marginalized, Filipinos, Mexicans, in the American landscape and finds solidarity with them. So this is a case of transnational feminism.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. There is another question. Can you elaborate on Mayo poetic view of the land in the edge of the sacred?
Mythopoetic, yeah. There is this notion that myth and truth are antithetical. Okay.
Okay.
So in this case, when you look at the land and you look at the myths associated with the land, you don't take it as some tall tale or some kind of story that is made up and that you should be very dismissive of. But on the other hand, myth is truth.
Okay.
Myth is truth to live by. And the land is sacred. That is the most important thing. I don't know if I emphasize that. The land is sacred. See, for example, when I was traveling, when I was going around Vipa, there is a sacred grove where there is a kind of plant called what they call teeling, and the sticks from the sticks of that teeling are used in ceremony during a particular period of the year. So there is a kind of purification that they have to undergo to enter that sacred grove, and they cannot enter it on other times of the year. When they have to, and they enter it only for this purpose, and they have to be pure. So, and definitely there are places which are off limits, and in the traditional culture they are told not to go there. But when we look at, there's a lot written about people scaling the Everest. The idea of scaling a mountain and reaching the summit is very much a white man's notion of success.
Yeah.
Right? The idea of overcoming nature, overpowering all the forces of nature, but that is not there in the Aboriginal worldview. So you see, there's that in Central Australia, there's Uluru, Ayers Rock. Ayers Rock is the Western name. Uluru is the traditional name, and I haven't been to Uluru, but when tourists travel towards Uluru, you find Aboriginal people standing on the way and pleading with them not to climb Uluru because it is a sacred rock for them.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Another question. Do you think that Australian literary works by Aborigines haven't got enough recognition in mainstream literary realm as compared to their counterparts like Indian Dalit writings?
I don't know why. Probably because it is the antipodes, whether it's the geographical location being located, at the antipodes, that has brought it less recognition. There's more recognition for Native American writing than Australian Aboriginal, I would say. And it could be just the politics of location. Maybe researchers would find America a better location or more attractive location than Australia.
Okay.
And also, I must also say that Australian Aboriginal people are very resentful of research and researchers, because that has contributed to their being colonized and to their dispossession. Sir told me to speak about, research methodology. I didn't have time.
Okay.
One book that you can look at, Decolonizing Linda Toohey Smith.
Okay, ma'am. And even there are some participants who are asking for the video which you promised to show
Yes.
at the end.
Yes.
And we haven't.
I'd like to close with the video from.
Okay, fine. Okay, fine.
Yeah,
ma'am.
I'll play that video.
Yeah, not.
Can I?
Can I ask another question, ma'am? Not now,
Yes,
ma'am.
yes, yes.
We have time. How does the Australian government repay the injustice which had done to the indigenous community? There is a question.
Can you repeat?
How does the Australian government repay the injustice which had done to the indigenous community?
Okay. I think injustices have been and are being redressed. Lot of scholarships for Aboriginal students. When I was studying in University of New South Wales, I found there was a separate center for Aboriginal students. And I thought we could also have such centers for our students, Dalit or Adivasi students or whatever, where they feel comfortable. They are with each other, and it is very empowering to be with your own people, especially when the campus has diversity. But when you find yourself alone, it's better to have those bonds across communities. So they do have indigenous centers for indigenous people. They scholarships are there, opportunities are there. So I do think, and then in terms of land rights and native title, then wherever there is mining taking place, the mining companies have to give a lot of money to the local community by way of compensation. So actually they can live on that money, many of them. They don't have to work.
Okay. And there is a question from YouTuber. In the present scenario, with the kind of rapid environmental changes that the world is witnessing as never before, can we consider the landscape or nature as text which is sending a strong message?
Yes, the landscape is undergoing a great change. If you think of Coca-Cola company, even, on the outskirts of Chennai. And,
very much related to
in the midst of lush green fields, you see Coca-Cola company over there.
Yes.
So that is a graphic, if you take a photograph of it, it will be a very graphic representation of capitalism incursion into the land.
Okay, ma'am. There are too many appreciations in the chat box, which I would like to convey, ma'am. With that, shall we go to the formal vote of thanks, sir?
Shall I share the video? I have to share
okay. Sir,
I just like to conclude with this video.
Okay, ma'am. You just go on, ma'am. We shall continue later. Yeah, please.
Prince Savage, and you've been so many places. I guess it must be so, but still I cannot see if the savage one is me. How can there be so much that you don't know? You don't know. You think you own whatever land you land on. The earth is just a dead thing you can claim. But I know every rock and tree and creature has a life, has a spirit, has a name. You think the only people who are people are the people who look and think like you. But if you walk the footsteps of a stranger, you'll learn things you never knew, you never knew. Have you ever heard the wolf cry to the blue corn moon, or ask the grinning bobcat why he grinned? Can you sing with all the voices of the mountain? Can you paint with all the colors of the wind? Can you paint with all the colors of the wind? the forest. Come taste the sun-sweet berries of the earth. Come roll in all the riches all around you, and for once never wonder what they're worth. The rainstorm and the river are my brothers. The heron and the otter are my friends, and we are all connected to each other in a circle, in a hoop that never ends. How high does the sycamore grow? If you cut it down, then you'll never know. And you'll never hear the wolf cry to the blue corn moon. For whether we are white or copper-skinned, we need to sing with all the voices of the mountain. Need to paint with all the colors of the wind. You can own the earth and still all you'll own is earth until you can paint with all the colors of the wind.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a wonderful video. Sir, shall I go on with my vote of thanks, formal vote of thanks?
So, yeah, carry on.
Yes, sir.
Go with your.
I extend my profound thanks to the speaker of the day, Dr. Maria Preeti Srinivasan, Head and Associate Professor, Queen Mary's College, for have accepted the invitation and for giving out such a wonderful talk with topic of utmost importance. Thank you, ma'am. I'm sure the participants would have had a very good experience. I express my sincere thanks to the Principal in charge, Dr. Devanathan, for his support in conducting this webinar series. I thank the IQAC team, especially Dr. Abdul Rahim, for his tireless backup to the event. I thank Dr. V.S. Ramakrishnan, the Head Department of English and convener of this wonderful series of webinars. I thank the staff members of Department of English Presidency College, my colleagues. My thanks are due to the participants in and across the country, the pillars of this event. I also thank the participants who are watching through YouTube. Once again, I thank each and everyone for your cooperation. Over to the head of the department. Sir?
Thank you very much. Definitely, it was an interesting session. We learn a lot from it, especially to crown it all. That video itself, it sums up everything you wanted to convey. So it was an excellent presentation. I'm happy that you have accepted the invitation extended to you. And I hope that the audience would move out of this auditorium with learning, with a kind of, they could have learned a lot by your excellent lecture. I think it would even promote some kind of interest about indigenous literature in their minds, that I hope that in the time to come, most of them would turn to Australian or any other indigenous literature which have not been well researched. And that is what your lecture has done to them. And I hope that it would definitely bring out so many good research works in future in the particular field. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you, sir.
Shall we wind up the session, sir?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Rahim,
Thank
sir.
you, Rahim, sir.
Okay, thank you, madam. Thank you.
Great confidence I had that you were there.
Okay, yes, madam. Okay. Really, we enjoyed the video. All, no, might have enjoyed the video. Final touch.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good night, sir.
Thank you,
Thank you.
madam.